As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected people who are obese more seriously than those who are normal weight. It's put the spotlight once again back on a, no pun intended, growing problem. Now, we are supposed to be sorting this out. Back in 2013, the United Nations set global health goals for 2025. Amongst them was a target to cut obesity, to bring it down and to keep it at 2010 levels. A very modest goal, you would say. Every country is on course to miss that goal. Indeed, a review of policies worldwide found that no country anywhere has been able to reduce obesity countrywide. Not one. Surely it's time to stop pretending that more of the same is going to magically achieve different results. Surely it's time to ask some hard questions as to why the failure, and is there actually anything we can do that would work any better? Well, let's have a look. Every year we see more and more initiatives designed to solve obesity. And while those programs run for a while and then get replaced or added to by new initiatives and new programs, almost never does anybody point to the whole jumble and just point out that obesity has continued to rise through it all. You can talk about people who are overweight and people who are normal weight, but the fact is that overweight is now normal. In the UK, overweight is greater than 50% for every age group over the age of 25, and mostly a lot over 50%. In the US, it's been a similar picture, with only Mexico having a higher percentage of overweight and obese people. Is it purely down to the environment of American life? Not really, because around a third of people manage to live in America and not be obese. And there must be some cultural elements, because if you break it down by race, you find that Black and Hispanic are the most affected groups, with white, non-Hispanic not too far behind, but Asians are not remotely in the same ballpark. When it comes to childhood obesity, Chile and Greece nudge ahead of the US, and Mexico drops a little behind, but these are fine distinctions in the Porky Olympics, and neither is the UK far behind the leading pack either. The World Health Organization has a global action plan on diet, physical activity and health. It says that it wants member states to promote policies to improve diet and to encourage physical activity. It says that it thinks the role of government is crucial in achieving lasting change in public health. Governments have a primary steering and stewardship role in initiating and developing the strategy, ensuring that it's implemented and monitoring its impact in the long term. Well, if it's their primary role, let's hope they're going to be good at it. In the UK, there have been a range of initiatives, including promoting better food labelling, bans on advertising certain foods to children, improving school food a bit, pushing companies to reduce salt and sugar in ready meals and other processed foods, and encouraging people to be active. In the US, the Centre for Disease Control sought to encourage physical activity, consumption of fruit and vegetables, reduced consumption of sugary drinks, decreased television viewing, and so on. In other words, a bunch of encouraging, some would say nagging people to improve their lifestyles. And they produce sophisticated and well thought through diagrams like this one, showing all the factors that influence how people behave. And you can look at it and recognise that it's all correct. Individuals are influenced by their environment, and then there are all these different organisations that affect that environment, and that's all underpinned by social norms and values. The problem is then you get programs where people say you have to address all these different things at once. All these institutions need to be on board. Change has to go throughout the entire system. And it's all very intelligent, but in practice, it ended up with Michelle Obama trying to get black kids to exercise more. And, a variety of other things replicated across the nation. Meanwhile, people got fatter, not thinner. Mexico had a similar range of initiatives, so did Canada with its so-called whole-of-society approach. Eventually you start seeing the same initiatives appearing again and again in these programs, because of course countries are always looking to each other for ideas. The ones you see most often, taxing sugary drinks or sugar more generally to make it more expensive than the sugar-free alternatives. not giving kids junk food in schools, restrictions on advertising certain foods, especially to kids, requirements for nutrition labelling, public awareness campaigns, because you can't count the numbers of people who change their entire lifestyles on the basis of a public awareness campaign. Many of these programs state that they are evidence-based. They don't seem to dwell on the evidence that the programs aren't working. What they mean, of course, is that they follow the science when it comes to recommending what you should eat. Which would be a good thing if the science was actually robust in that area. Come back to that later. What do you do if you set targets for improvement and your program consistently fails to meet the targets? Well, there's a clue in this study, which reviewed what various countries were doing. It is interesting to note that internationally, strategies have begun to move away from specific targets included in earlier obesity strategies. There are several reasons for this, but the foremost being that those targets were not achieved. Genius! Failing to meet the targets? Stop setting targets. At that point, you really are admitting that you are just digging holes and filling them in again, which at least, would constitute physical activity for the people who were digging the holes. Might actually be a more effective approach than what you're actually doing. It then gives an example in the spirit of sharing best practice, of course. The Swedish government's public health policy is not target-driven. Instead, it focuses on creating the right environment for people to improve their own health through influencing workplace and education policy. Meanwhile, between 1995 and 2017, severe obesity in Sweden increased by 153%, with obesity up 86% and overweight by 23%. But that's okay, because it's not like we're setting targets or anything. So we can't find any countries that have adopted public policy that successfully reduced obesity. But there are some countries that suffer from the problem significantly less. And I don't mean the ones like North Korea, who accomplished that weight control miracle by running the country so badly that people are actually starving. The star of the world turns out to be Japan, which has just 4% obesity rate compared to over 30% at the other end of the scale. And it's worth asking why Japan has been so untroubled with obesity, since it has been a wealthy enough society for many decades now. There are a number of straightforward answers. Some of them won't be popular with the people who ask such questions, but we should be prepared to stare the facts in the face regardless of how they make you feel. So here goes. 1. In Japan, being overweight is not socially acceptable and people let you know it. If you're fat, it's assumed you're inefficient and lazy. Friends and family members will actively rib you if they think you're putting some on. You can throw your hands up and call it fat shaming if you want, but it is what it is. In the West, you'll now see people describing obesity as a disease that people are afflicted with, and people are living with obesity as though it just sort of happened to them randomly and they were unlucky. Well, that's not how they talk about it in Japan. Indeed, there is now a law, the Metabo law, that means that companies have to monitor the waist size of their employees and work with them to reduce if they get beyond a certain girth. No reason why that would be controversial, obviously. 2. Whether eating at home or in restaurants, standard portion sizes for Japanese meals are significantly below what we have in the West. If you're of the view that refined carbohydrates are a huge dietary problem, then portion control is probably the factor that helped Japanese stay slim, even though white rice is such a major staple of their diet. 3. Red meat is pretty expensive in Japan, which means that most meals get higher proportions of rice and vegetables, and fish and other seafood makes up a significant proportion of the protein as well. 4. There's a tradition there of what's called hara hachibu, which means stopping eating when you're nearly full to avoid feeling uncomfortable. It means that culturally it's seen as a positive character trait to finish eating while you still have some food on your plate. In most Western cultures, not finishing your food is seen as wasteful and indeed rude. 5. Nobody eats dessert. There are very few Japanese desserts. It's just not a big part of a culture. 6, eating with chopsticks means you eat slower, which gives your body more time to send the signals that it's satisfied, which doesn't happen if you shovel food down your face as fast as some of us manage. 7, they eat more fermented foods. And this means that the gut flora of Japanese people is healthier. We've learned a lot in recent years about how much the gut bacteria have a significant function in controlling weight. And finally, 8, they drink flavoured teas with 0 calories as their primary beverage, not sugary sodas. Unlike us, around 52% of the sugar that Westerners consume every day comes in the form of soft drinks. Now then, what do we take from all that? Well, predominantly that Japan has developed a culture that was optimised to healthy behaviours. 5 of the key things on that list are purely to do with cultural norms, with the other 3 being about types of food or drinks consumed. With the exception of the Metabo law, none of them rely on the government. And those cultural norms have been very strongly applied. Japan is a very group-oriented culture, contrasting with individualistic cultures like the US and the UK. The leadership expert Fons Trompenaar described them in contrast to Americans like this. Americans, he said, are like peaches. There's a lot of softness on the outside, which is public space, and just a small private core. He gave the example that if you stay with some Americans, they'll say things like, help yourself to whatever's in the fridge. And when I stayed with some Canadians a few years ago, they invited me, I remember, to take their car for a drive if a fancy took me, which, being an uptight Brit, I would never have been able to bring myself to do. But that's the sort of thing that he meant. Japanese, however, are, according to Trompenaar, like coconuts. There is almost no public space, but if you're in, then you're wholly in. I learned this when I used to travel and speak in different countries. If you're hosted by a group in Japan, at the end of your visit, you praise the group that hosted you. You don't single out the individual who did such a good job of looking after you, unless you want to embarrass them and offend everybody else, which is what I did. Now, a group society like that exists on understood cultural norms which get enforced. One of them is not letting yourself go. And look, this makes obvious intuitive sense. If you make something acceptable, make apologies for it, even make it desirable, then people will have no boundaries to keep them from it. As a society, we normalised obesity, and now it has become the norm, not the exception. When I looked at all those figures, that information about Japan, I immediately wondered whether those traditional norms were breaking down yet. Because in the internet age, most traditional norms are being undermined, except maybe in countries like China, where they actively prevent exposure to the outside world by their citizens. I did a search on the scientific literature to see if there was any evidence of increase in obesity in Japan, and the answer is yes. Obesity is on the rise in Japan as it is elsewhere, and the same for childhood obesity as well. And that's largely because with the younger members of Japanese society, those old cultural norms are being challenged and are breaking down. You can see it in this graph, with the consumption of rice falling and meat rising. Diets are becoming westernized and families are starting the same journey many of our societies have already travelled, with less and less cooking at home. A recent study showed that increasing levels of obesity were particularly to be found in Japanese families where they didn't have a home cooking tradition. And with the growing numbers of larger people, some are starting to challenge the stigma in the same way that people in the West have done, with body positivity messages suggesting that however unhealthily obese you are, you're nevertheless beautiful and should be accepted for all your lardy goodness. And as in the West, there has been more talk about the impact on mental health and well-being on the pressure to stay thin, with more visibility for suffering from anorexia nervosa and bulimia. Now, were those a problem in past decades when the culture was just what it was? Or have they arisen along with the internet age and with the adoption of Western diets? That, I don't know. Problems like that could easily have been there for decades, but were never acknowledged or talked about, because that's a very common situation in a restrictive culture. Lots of things that don't get talked about. Other Asian countries that have been doing quite well are now at the top of the index of those that are on the fastest rate of increase in obesity. For instance, Vietnam and Laos. The truth is that countries that had positive food cultures often did so because of constraints on choice. And once you release those constraints and they get given free choice, they will freely choose the diets of the West, at least some of the time. Not because they're necessarily better diets, but because you're naturally attracted to the things that were previously unattainable. We used to have healthier food cultures of our own, back in the days when you had to eat what was local by necessity. People like environmentalists sometimes idealise those simpler times. They forget or don't realise that those were also days when your family and your cultural in-group had all sorts of expectations and rules that constrained you, just like Japan, and which we would see as intolerable tyranny in contrast to societies today. In the absence of such rules, families have defaulted to cultural traditions that they've established for themselves. And we're at the point now where many children are being raised by parents who didn't experience home cooking when they were kids, and so they're passing on those behaviours to their own kids. In her book First Bite, How We Learn to Eat, B. Wilson observed how food preferences are all learned behaviour. Food likes and dislikes have been shown in numerous scientific studies from psychologists, from neuroscientists, from anthropologists and biologists. They all agree that our appetite for specific foods is learned. She quoted the work of Dr. Clara Marie Davis in 1926, who carried out an extended experiment which would be ruled somewhat unethical now, where a group of orphan children were placed on a special self-selection diet. At each meal they were offered a selection of 10 foods from a longer list, all mashed, ground up or finely minced. The list ranges from different fruits, different vegetables, fish, meats and even offal. And they could pick whatever they wanted, and the nurse in attendance had to be silent and let them just do what they wanted with no guidance, no reinforcement. The vast majority showed enthusiasm for all the different options, with one or two exceptions where individuals shunned one or two of the things that they had to choose from. After a period of time, they developed their favourites, and these were completely different between the individuals. B. Wilson noted this: even though they were given no guidance on what their bodies needed, their ratio of calories averaged at protein 17%, fat 35% and carbohydrate 48%, very much in line with contemporary nutritional science. The children went on to be normal kids who were open to eating a range of different foods and didn't develop faddish stages like some kids do, where they'd refuse to eat anything but, their one favoured thing of the month, which is all very well. Of course, Dr. Davis didn't give them the option of junk. No chocolate, no white sugar, no pastries. So some people argued through 1980s that the study meant you could just trust kids to choose whatever they needed. That's not actually what the study showed. And studies with rats, because experiments on babies are, let me remind you, not ethical, have shown that it almost certainly doesn't work that way. The point was that kids today are often exposed to initial default choices that set them on longer-term patterns of food behaviour, and it's all learned. And the attitude of adults is key to this. A 2013 Australian study showed that the parents of healthy eating kids had a stronger belief in their own power to influence their child's food preferences than did the parents of unhealthy eaters. But what are you going to do about that? Since we're not going to recreate the sort of cultures that tend toward a healthy approach, is it all just hopeless? Should governments just give up trying to reduce obesity? Well, it may be too early to preach the gospel of despair. One thing's for sure, our predicament isn't helped by the appalling nonsense that is dietary research. John Ioannidis of Stanford University famously lambasted the quality of nutrition research in 2018. He said this: "The emerging picture of nutritional epidemiology is difficult to reconcile with good scientific principles. The field needs radical reform." And he said that a recent meta-analysis had associated almost all foods statistically with significant mortality risk. Assuming the meta-analysed evidence from cohort studies represents lifespan-long causal associations for a baseline life expectancy of 80 years, eating 12 hazelnuts daily would prolong life by 12 years, i.e. 1 year per hazelnut. Drinking 3 cups of coffee daily would achieve a similar gain by 12 extra years, and eating a single mandarin orange daily would add 5 years of life. Conversely, consuming 1 egg daily would reduce life expectancy by 6 years, and eating 2 slices of bacon daily would shorten life by a decade, an effect worse than smoking. Could these results possibly be true? The answer, of course, is no. He identified the problem being that randomized trials were not carried out. I mean, they're difficult to devise because there are so many hidden variables in how people live their lives. Research often involves very poor processes, asking people to self-identify what they ate during a certain time, and the opinions of researchers often drive what data are collected and reported, rather than data being examined from all angles to establish the meaning that they hold. So we ended up with massively confusing messages sent out to people. At one point, eggs were cholesterol bombs and you should eat them only in extreme moderation. But then it turns out that no, they're actually really good for you and nutritious, and the cholesterol from them isn't really much of a problem at all. 1 glass of wine is good for you. But then suddenly any is too much. And then back again the next week. So if you follow the news with a view to letting it shape your consumption habits, by now you're probably extremely confused and probably fat. The biggest error was the advice for decades that you should eat a low-fat diet, which turned out to be extremely poor advice. Getting the advice right would certainly be helpful. The truth is, it didn't make much difference anyway. B. Wilson noted this: the vast majority of people heard what the food police had to say on the subject of fat and ignored it. At the height of the low-fat orthodoxy in 1998, some of the leading nutrition scientists in the world co-authored a paper in which they lamented the public's failure to follow their guidelines. The scientists found to their dismay that after more than 2 decades of being advised to reduce fat, people were still eating about the same amount of it. The percentage of calories from fat in the American diet dropped slightly from 1976 to 1991, from about 36% in 76 to 34% in 91, but people were also consuming more total calories. So in absolute terms, the fat grams people consumed remained on average the same. That's not going to change just because the advice gets better. Eat a bit less, move around a bit more. Those are principles we've known for decades, and it's still not happening. David L. Katz of Yale University says this: our problem is not want of knowledge about the basic care and feeding of Homo sapiens. Our problem is a stunning and tragically costly cultural reluctance to swallow it. If governments really want to help people modify eating habits, there are a few things they could do. One is to be more restrictive on what are the defaults that companies are allowed to present to the population. Why not require standard Coca-Cola to be 0 calorie, while the current formulation, which you can of course keep selling because, freedom, has to be labelled as high calorie Coke. But in any case, exposure to higher levels of salt and sugar have been invisibly added to many foods. Requiring them to be invisibly scaled back would demonstrably be effective. When it comes to changing people's habits, the evidence suggests you should start with the very young. The SAPER method of food education has taken inspiration from the way the French traditionally educated children in the pleasures of food and turned it into a programme. Schools in Finland started running SAPER food education in the kindergartens, introducing kids to different foods, teaching them about the different kinds of flavour sensations, with the aim of widening their appreciation of good nutritious food when they weren't necessarily getting that from home. The area where this was piloted was one of those small number that has seen some reduction in child obesity. Now, it takes more than one programme because so many of the defaults presented to children push in the opposite direction. And that's kind of a point. If we're really going to solve the obesity problem, you have to build an active food culture. It would be one of the main things you ever talked about. I mean, it can be done. Japan largely invented its food culture after the Second World War. It didn't exist in its current form before then. But most of us don't want to embrace the restrictions that would come with that. Instead, we live in a world where all influences are given free rein and people default to less optimum behaviours. Even those societies where there have been those strong cultures that held the line, those cultures are now starting to degrade. We're all heading in the same direction because, given the choice, people are choosing to break free of constraints. You could conclude that leaves us with a message of despair. The most constructive thing you can do is stop wasting large amounts of public money on programs that don't work. And that wouldn't be a bad thing, to be fair. There is, though, research suggesting that you can at least open up the range of options that people see for themselves. Educate kids in understanding food and cooking in a way that their parents never got. And you at least empower them to make their own choices with better groundings of experience. Make it about positive appreciation of good food, not about endless nagging and restrictions, because that's being done right now all over the world and it's failed. I'm not saying that these are easy answers, but at least we have to start asking the right questions.